This is Austria defeats Prussia. This is number 16. Got your beverage. A little bit of ice. It's okay. Let's go.
In the aftermath of Frederick the Great's impressive victory at Rosbach, the dynamics of the war changed significantly. Things were finally looking up for Prussia, although their position was far from safe. The French retreat at Rosbach was marked, according to Fraser, by more than a customary atrocity. Destruction was indiscriminate, churches and altars were defiled. The country, people, treated deplorably. Despite this, Frederick could not shake the uneasy feeling of defeating his former allies. I can never get used to looking on the French as my enemies. Rosbach at best allowed Frederick to focus on other dangers, mainly the Austrians. Frederick knew this. He later wrote, "Strictly speaking, the Battle of Rosbach merely afforded me the freedom to go in search of new dangers in Silesia." Upon his success, Frederick's cousin, King George II of England, reconsidered the Peace of Klosterzeven and rejoined the war on Prussia's side. His son, the Duke of Cumberland, had been a disappointment. Frederick knew just the man for the job. Frederick's brother-in-law, Ferdinand, Duke of Brunswick, took over. His British-financed army would control the Western Front, fighting several iconic battles. So the Western, Northern and Eastern fronts of the war were relatively under control, for now. But that did not mean Frederick was free of worry. The Austrians were dead set on crushing the Prussian army in Silesia. Silesia lay more or less open for them after the Austrian victory at the Battle of Moys. Sure, Bevern fought all the way during his retreat, but heavily outnumbered, there was not much he could do. His retreat sacrificed strong points of defense. As Charles pursued Bevern with the characteristic Austrian sluggishness, he dispatched a 12,000-strong force under Ernst Dietrich Freiherr von Marschall. He held Lusatia, protecting the flank of the Austrians moving into Silesia. One day after his victory at Rosbach, Frederick collected his tired and his worn-down army, likely no more than 15,000 men. A grueling march lay before them. Autumn and early winter were an unusual time for a campaign such as this one, but for now, the mild weather assisted him. Prince Henry maintained Leipzig, and Keith took an army of equal size to make a feint attack against Prague and hopefully split up the Austrian army. We have to briefly look more in depth at the Austrian operations in Bohemia, Silesia and Saxony the month before Rosbach. Already in October, worrying information reached Frederick. Early that month, General Nadashti laid siege to the iconic fortress of Schweidnitz with some 43,000 soldiers and plenty of big guns. Bevern did manage to successfully pull back to Breslau. However, Breslau was in a very poor shape. Its population wasn't pro-Prussian and its walls and defenses were crumbling. Bevern decided to entrench his army in the southern suburbs of the city. All this happened in early October. But as we have come to know the Austrian campaigning, it stagnated thanks to the slow decision-making. This window provided Bevern with a very welcome opportunity to prepare for the approaching battle. As for Schweidnitz, the fortress held out against multiple assaults and continuous bombardments for over a month. They did not surrender until November 12, after inflicting heavy casualties against the Austrians. But the fortress was reduced to mostly rubble. The Austrians won. They captured 180 guns, 48 colors, 333,600 thalers, 2 months' worth of rations, and nearly 6,000 prisoners, among them 4 generals and nearly 200 officers. The Austrians lost 3,000 men, of whom 1,200 killed. This opened the road to Breslau, and it freed Nadashti's troops. They joined Prince Charles's army, which now numbered over 80,000 men. When news of Schweidnitz's capitulation reached Frederick, he was livid. He wrote Bevern he blamed him personally for the loss of the fortress since he didn't mount a relief effort. If Bevern and Generals Friedrich Kiau and Johann Lestwitz continued to act like old hogs, they would answer with their heads, as would all other generals who allowed themselves to to be ruled by cowardice and weakness. Meanwhile, word of Frederick's victory at Rosbach reached the Austrian camp. They realized the Prussian king would surely attempt to thwart their advance. Prince Charles did not feel like fighting in front of Breslau, but Maria Theresa and Dawn overruled him. When Frederick arrived at his quarters close by, heavy bombardment and gunfire were audible. He didn't know it yet, but later learned the Austrians stormed Bevern's camp in what became the Battle of Breslau. The Battle of Breslau was quite a muddled affair with multiple fronts going on. Prince Charles commanded up to 85,000 soldiers, at least 60,381 infantry in 96 battalions, 93 grenadier companies, and 23,220 cavalry in 141 squadrons. Additionally, he fielded 228 artillery pieces. In contrast, Bevern commanded between 21 and 28,400 troops, 40 battalions, and 102 squadrons. The Prussians were significantly outnumbered. However, the Oder and Lohe provided impossible defenses. Bevern positioned the Prussian army between Kosel in the north and Gräbchen in the south. His lines extended to Neudorf in the east. His army was snugly entrenched with infantry defending strategic villages. He hoped it would make up for his numerical inferiority. Zieten held the Prussian left between Grieten and Kleinburg. Lieutenant General von Lestwitz commanded infantry at Höfgen. The Prussians erected defenses south of Gräbchen and Gabitz. The battle was preceded by 2 days of heavy artillery shelling from both sides. The Austrians, mauled by heavy fire, installed 7 pontoon bridges across the Lohe, 3 northwest of Schmeidfeld, and 4 southeast of Kleinmückberg. In the early morning of November 22, the Austrians finished deploying from Massowitz all the way to Hartlieb. The cavalry followed the infantry, Charles on the left, Nadashdy on the right. The reserves under General Witt deployed behind Großmückbern. The battle commenced with Nadashdy's 3 columns advancing across the pontoon bridges. He wanted to attack the entrenchments at Gabitz. Meanwhile, to the far north, Beck advanced from the northwest. He quickly expelled a minor Prussian force holding Ostwitz. Then he installed 3 artillery pieces on the banks of the Oder, launching volleys for the remainder of the day. The Duke of Bevern did not believe Charles's main attack would be across his western flank, reinforcing Zieten's flank. Nadashdy's grenadiers launched an attack against Kleinburg. Neither commander dared to commit their full force. The outnumbered Prussian battalion defended the village with vigor. Battle continued for a while, but they ended up yielding the village and took their positions to the north. When the infantry to the north launched a counterattack, the Austrians fled the village. Zieten's hussars chased the fleeing Austrians. Nadashdy ordered his entire army to retreat to their original positions. As the status quo returned, Zieten relayed to Bevern how Nadashdy's sizable force would surely attempt another counterattack. In the event, Nadashdy would not, but for the remainder of the battle, Zieten and Nadashdy remained face to face, not engaging in combat. This was especially bad for the Prussians, as it hogged valuable manpower. To the west, the fighting was much more.
Is he not attacking because he's keeping the Prussians spread out thin? And then they're going to kind of pick and choose where the weakness is? And if, instead of just engaging it, just, they did a little test. It kind of worked, and then it backfired. So now someone else is going to get a taste? Is that how it's going? Is that where it's going?
Intense. Right after noon, the entire Austrian army, including reserves, began their march across the pontoon bridges. Additionally, some light infantry and 1,000 regular infantry crossed the dense Pilsnitz forest from the north to launch an attack against the Prussian right flank. The army crossing the bridge at Großmückbern rapidly advanced. They faced fierce resistance at Kleinmückbern and suffered an infantry charge between Kleinmückbern and Grabchen. Lieutenant General Pennever led his cuirassier brigade against the Austrian infantry. Sustaining heavy casualties, they barely inflicted any damage. During the charge, Pennever was mortally wounded. By this time, the Austrians seized the abandoned trenches, installing their artillery there. Shortly thereafter, the entire Prussian infantry was evicted from the villages and the Austrians took over. The infantry began their retreat towards the entrenchments near Gabitz. Bevern ordered several cavalry squadrons to launch another cavalry charge against the Austrian grenadiers holding Gräbchen. But thanks to additional reinforcements, the cavalry was easily repelled. Lestwitz's left flank was threatened by the Austrians holding these villages. As combat continued between Klein-Mückbern and Gräbchen, Macquarie and Arenberg had crossed the Lohe from Neukirch towards Schmidfeld. Because they were exposed to the Prussian artillery, they suffered many more casualties, but their attack against the entrenchments around Schmidfeld favored them. Heavy combat commenced, as the Prussians reportedly resisted until all ammunition was expended. Reinforcements sent by Lestwitz could not change the course of the battle. Near Hüfgen, Wied launched a frontal charge against the weakening infantry. They resisted until the Austrians around Klein-Mückbern were close to circling around them. The assault in the north focused beyond Pilsnitz. Gau and Lestwitz desperately defended the crossing against overwhelming numbers, not to mention the increasing danger of flanking from the south. The marshy and uneven terrain, in combination with accurate Prussian artillery shelling, saw Austrian casualties mount. Supported by cavalry, the infantry launched 3 charges against the redoubts around Pilsnitz. Both sides suffered heavy casualties, but each time the Austrians were driven back. To their north, the Prussian Feldjäger engaged in guerrilla-like warfare against the Austrian Grenzers, trekking through the Pilsnitz forest. These skirmishes continued throughout the day, but saw no fruitful incursions by the Austrians. As the sun began setting at 5:30 p.m., the Austrians launched their 4th assault. This time, it proved successful. The Prussian infantry retreated, and the Austrians rapidly seized the strongpoints, but could not continue past the trenches dug behind them. They didn't want to anyway. It was getting too dark. Behind the front lines throughout the day, Bevern had scrambled to collect forces and launch a counterattack. He decided Wied's reserve corps was the most viable target. At around 6 p.m., he collected 14 battalions ready to launch an attack. When they launched against the Austrians at Schmidfeld, Hüfgen and Klein-Mückbern, heavy combat around the villages followed. The Prussian assault was only broken thanks to the intervention of Austrian cavalry on both flanks, threatening to cut them off. Klein-Gundau became Prussia's most forward base. No attempts were made to attempt and seize it. The armies fought for 15 hours that day. The front extended 11 kilometers. It can safely be said the Austrians had the upper hand, but the Prussians sure fiercely resisted, despite being outnumbered nearly 3-1. Only Zieten's wing maintained its original positions, thanks.
So it didn't quite turn out how I was expecting. I guess, sorry. I'm using the mouse because you can't see my fingers when I'm pointing at things. So he attacked first. And then I thought they would, kind of maybe send here, hit this town. I'm calling it a town, village, whatever it is. And then maybe come up over here and hit here. I thought they would test the weakness. Well, they did. They just got a foothold into their area. So, interesting. I'll say this. The Prussian battles, I expect less if Frederick isn't leading them. That's understandable, right? Because he seems to pull rabbits out of hats and all kinds of stuff.
Tunadash is in action. It is unclear what happened that night. Some sources indicate Bevern wanted to launch a counterattack the following morning. Other sources indicate he ordered the general retreat. All that is for sure is that during nighttime, in utter silence, the Prussian army began its retreat via Breslau across the Oder. General Lestwitz and 10 battalions remained behind to defend Breslau against the inevitable siege. The casualties were significant. The Prussians lost 6,350 men, at least 800 killed, among whom 1 general and 150 officers. 3 generals were mortally wounded. Another 3,800 men deserted, and some 700 were captured.
Wow.
In total, the Austrian casualties numbered some 5,800. 649 soldiers and 44 officers were killed. 235 officers and 4,464 men were wounded. Another 460 went missing. They lost 1 general and 6 wounded.
Jeez.
The way the Battle of Breslau ended was perhaps a bit sudden and definitely wasn't a traditional victory or defeat. The retreat, though arguably understandable, did not sit well with Frederick. The Prussian king was close to the battle after all. Bevern certainly felt his wrath. It just so happened, as he retreated, Bevern received the king's opinion on the fall of Schweidnitz. He could guess the king's response to his retreat from Breslau. That night, Bevern stumbled upon an Austrian outpost. He supposedly mistook it for a Prussian outpost and allowed himself to be captured. It is generally believed this was done on purpose in order to avoid the likely capital punishment Frederick threatened him with. Bevern was eventually taken to Vienna, and after 1 year he was later released without asking for ransom, thanks to his family ties to the royal family. Upon his return to Prussia, Frederick appointed him as governor of Stettin, but not before again fighting on the Prussian side, though the king continued to despise him. The capture of Breslau added another one, and frankly the final, Silesian stronghold to the Austrian tally. They controlled the province now. To the west, Frederick commanded an army outnumbered at least 3-1, just like at Rosbach. The future of his kingdom depended on what happened next. Against all rules of warfare, Frederick decided to seek the confrontation with a much larger army. It culminated in the legendary Battle of Leuthen. Thank you very much for watching this video. If there's...
I didn't talk a whole lot on that, because I really didn't... I was enjoying it, so I apologize. Yeah, I'm going to end this here. This is number 16. There are 20 of these, so I'll get through them, obviously. I'm going to try to release... I'd like to release 2 of these a week. I'm also doing 2 of the Pacific. I want to do 2 of the Muslim expansion, and still do 2 Caesar. Damn, that's 8. Yeah, I probably won't be able to do all those because I'm still fitting in other videos too. Oh well. Look, I release them when I can, and I try to space them out. I understand that I've spaced these a little further out than I'd like, but it is what it is. But they will be released, I promise. So I'm going to end this here, and like and subscribe. Have a good day, have a good night.